Good morning. Welcome to the Library Television Network and welcome to this edition of the Coal Scene. Today we're going to be exploring and talking about many of the environmental related issues and policies that have impacted West Virginia's coal industry over the past year and a half. Those initiatives range from increased involvement from the Environmental Protection Agency, a barrage of regulatory proposals from the Office of Surface Mining, and a number of initiatives that have come directly from the President's Council on the Environment. Joining us today, and our guest today, is Jason Bostic with the West Virginia Coal Association. Jason devotes the majority of his time on these environmental issues and is fastly becoming one of the nation's experts in mine environmental issues and environmental policy matters. Jason, it's a real pleasure to have you with us here today, and we look forward to talking about these various policy issues, and with an eye towards helping our viewers perhaps better understand what all's involved and some of the intricacies of these proposals.
I'm glad to be here. I'll try to do my best.
Well, why don't we start with with going back and reflecting perhaps over the last 18 months and just talking generally about some of the initiatives that have had an impact on the coal industry here in West Virginia. And from my perspective, it appears that a number of these initiatives really only deal with the mining industry here in West Virginia.
That's correct, because you have to go back to January of '08, when the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, which has an oversight role in Corps of Engineers permitting, what we call Clean Water Act Section 404 dredge and fill permits. Those are required anytime you're going to do any kind of activity in the stream. They're issued by the Corps of Engineers, but the Federal Environmental Protection Agency has an oversight role to play there. And typically EPA has been very restrained in their use of that oversight role. And that all changed in January of '08. Strongly worded letters recommending denial of certain Corps of Engineer permits, specifically for the mining industry in West Virginia, began to arrive with regular certainty beginning in January. And we've been dealing with that ever since. Later, I believe it was in '09, EPA again has an oversight role to play in the Section 402 Clean Water Act MPDS permitting. Those are the discharge permits associated with any type of activity, including a coal mine. EPA began to object to the state's issuance of those permits for mining operations. And generally EPA's involvement has been, as you said, restricted to coal mining, and specifically restricted to Appalachian coal mining. The 6 states that comprise the Appalachian coal region here in this country.
Looking back also, about the same time that many of these objection letters started to flow from EPA, there was a major legislative initiative underway, being a cap and trade legislation. And also during that time, it seems like the stage was being set for a lot of onerous or negative actions that would come out of the federal government. There's cap and trade legislation being debated within the halls of Congress, and of course that was prompted and initiated by the Obama administration. And at the same time, there were a lot of negative words or statements against coal that was appearing in the press. So it stands to reason that there would be some restrictive or onerous policy issues that would follow, once the stage was set.
Yeah, I think that's accurate, because in the federal government, in this regard, with respect to surface mining and the day-to-day permitting processes we have to undertake, actually issued what I refer to it as a blueprint. It was a memorandum of understanding between EPA, the Federal Office of Surface Mining and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and the White House Council on Environmental Quality, which is sort of a special subgroup that exists within the Executive Office of the White House. And it laid out specific actions that these agencies of the federal government would take over a year, 2 years, 3 years to generally restrict surface mining in Appalachia. And while the MOU was very careful to characterize this as a surface mining only initiative, as you know, you cannot arbitrarily restrict things just to surface mining. Every initiative that's been discussed will ultimately apply to underground mining, either through the fields that we construct to access the coal seam, the face-up area, or the coal refuse fields that are built to handle the coal preparation plant reject. So we've just had a barrage of initiatives that has really almost, well, virtually stopped the permitting process on a federal standpoint here in West Virginia and in the other Appalachian states that comprise this region.
I recall, again, going back 16, 18 months ago, when these objection letters from EPA were first issued, we heard things like, the permit process is stalling. The federal government has issued a moratorium on new mining permits, and of course, they indicated it was not a moratorium, but yet they were going to subject these permits, primarily just in West Virginia, within the Appalachian area, to a more stringent review. One of the things that I get asked routinely was, were these permits permitting new operations, and were they previously approved by the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection and the Corps of Engineers?
Yes, because in both instances, for the most part, when the new review initiatives had started, actually even EPA itself had already once looked at the majority of these permits, especially the Corps permits, through their oversight role, and had chosen not to exercise their objection ability then. When the change of administration and all these new initiatives are announced, the EPA decides they would like to take another look at those permits, and that's when the objections start to arrive. But these operations had received a Surface Coal Mining and Reclamation Act permit issued by the state of West Virginia, the MPDS Discharge Section 402 Clean Water Act permit from West Virginia, and the Corps of Engineers permit was the only thing that was left to be issued. So that is the only opportunity that EPA had to interfere in the process. So they exercised that right, or that ability. And since then, permits have slowed, stalled, and just trickled out. And to the extent that they have been issued, they were either issued by the Corps over the objection of EPA, or the Corps and a particular coal company and EPA sat down to negotiate certain restrictive conditions that EPA thought was needed on the permit.
How many permits were actually affected when the objection letters from EPA were initially submitted?
Well, there were about 6 that were filed initially, 6 objection letters, and that morphed into one of these enhanced coordinated review processes that you spoke of that applied to a universe of about 42 to 48 permits here in West Virginia. And those permits were, again, almost on the crux of being issued by the Corps after they'd gone through all the previous environmental reviews. But since that time, the EPA's enhanced interference, is the way I like to refer to it, with permits have covered everything in West Virginia. Every single coal mine, whether it was a surface mine or an underground mining operation, not only the 404 permit from the Corps of Engineers, the federal permit, but the 402 permit issued by the state of West Virginia.
Now, were the majority of these permits permitting mining reserves and coal seams in areas that had previously been mined?
Yes.
Or were these in new territories where mining's not taking place?
I would say, Chris, for the most part, about 70 to 85% of the permits were continuations of existing operations. But I would say, given the nature of the reserve base here in West Virginia, that about 100% of them probably are occurring where historic mining's already taken place. We're going back through the current mining and reclamation processes and correcting years-old environmental problems created by mining that was conducted in the 20s, 30s, and 40s.
Well, speaking of that, one of the things that's intrigued me, particularly with surface mining or even mountaintop mining, is when you look at the you know, the manner in which these mines are laid out and designed, and the manner in which they progress through an area, they will often, as part of the active mining operation, remove or eliminate environmental hazards, high walls, refuge piles, even mine fires that are burning, or, you know, because of lightning strikes or whatever. And these were environmental scars, if you will, that resulted from mining 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago, or even longer.
Yes, that's pretty typical, especially in southern West Virginia. Every coal reserve, as you know, especially again in southern West Virginia, has been nibbled on to some degree, either by ancient underground mining or surface mining, rough surface mining techniques that were practiced in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, where high walls were created, shoot and shove operations. And there really wasn't, even though West Virginia had a reclamation law then, our understanding and complexity relative to reclamation had not advanced to the point that it has now. So new mining operations, quote unquote new mining operations, can correct a lot of those environmental problems.
I recall one of the local operations, I think it's one of the relatively large surface mines within the Cabin Creek area. If I'm not mistaken, it was said that from the time that operation began until the time it exhausted the reserve base, it will have removed some 20-some miles of high wall, dangerous high walls that were left from mining operations, again, 40, 50 years ago.
Yep.
Does that number sound about right?
It does. Because in addition to the high walls, there were several burning coal refuse piles that were left behind from deep mining operations in the 50s and 40s, when coal production on Cabin Creek ramped up to meet the demands of the Second World War. And that reserve base, again, had been nibbled on from all sides using older, outdated technology, and was essentially not reclaimed. But when the current mining operation is done, it'll be reclaimed to the highest standards that are recognized all around the country.
That's interesting. These mining permits that were being held in abeyance by EPA, and you mentioned there was 40-some. What does that mean, 40-some mining permits? How much production, how many jobs, how many miners does that really affect?
Well, the exact numbers are somewhat elusive, but several million tons, at least probably 200 million tons, and probably 400 to 500 jobs, either a continuation of existing employment or the initiation of new mining. So it has a pretty serious effect on West Virginia's coal production and its employment levels, and because it compromises production, it will compromise our economic standing when West Virginia has been able to maintain a pretty relatively decent budget through these lean times, but that's largely because of coal production. Well, if you begin to restrict or cut off that artery of tax revenue from the coal industry, it's going to hurt everyone, not just those that show up at the mine every day to work, but the folks over here in the Capitol that have to figure out how to figure the budget to keep essential social services functioning. So it really is pretty serious, and it's even more damaging when coal prices begin to increase, since, as you know, the severance tax is tied to the price of the coal. As coal prices increase, as the demand for this coal goes up, especially metallurgical coal for steelmaking, if the permits aren't processed correctly and in a timely fashion, West Virginia will miss out on the opportunity to collect a greater percentage of revenue from that coal production. And we will lose that market opportunity to other regions, other countries, especially with when you're dealing with met coal. That's typically only an Appalachian product, at least in this country. So if we can't mine it in Appalachia, it will come from China or Indonesia or South America, other places.
Well, it's interesting. Not only does the state of West Virginia compete in the global or international marketplace with a number of foreign countries, we also find here within our borders, if you will, the United States, we find that there's several million tons of coal that we're competing with that's actually winning out on markets here within the United States. I know there's a relatively large quantity of coal coming from Colombia, some from Venezuela, coming within the United States.
Yes, and this only further exacerbates that problem. You know, West Virginia has an experienced workforce, a very mature environmental regulatory program, and when you have interference from federal agencies like EPA or the Federal Office of Surface Mining that do not have day-to-day responsibility for implementing these programs, then it really does create a great deal of chaos. And in a frustrating, at least from our perspective or the coal industry's perspective, is you know, the programs were established by Congress, the Clean Water Act and the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act, to give the states primary authority to regulate operations within their borders because they were best suited to be aware of local conditions and how the geology laid and how the water flowed through the area. And EPA and OSM have essentially, at least from our perspective, set out to undo that intent. It's almost like they want to federalize these state programs. And there is a way that EPA or OSM can revoke approval of a program, but instead of following those legal procedures, EPA and OSM have chosen not to do that. They're doing a lot of this through policy statements. And it's essentially rulemaking without going through a public comment or robust public debate process. And it's illegal rulemaking to the detriment of our legislature and our state agencies.
Well, I certainly understand that. You know, it's one thing for federal agencies to hold up on issuing new permits or creating more obstacles, so it becomes more difficult, more costly, more so it's unpredictable when or if a mining permit will be ultimately issued. Let's talk about the Spruce Mine that borders Logan and Boone County, I believe. Mm-hmm. Here's a situation where a mining operation probably underwent the most stringent review of any mining facility or operation in the country, certainly from within the Appalachian area here, or the Appalachian region. The permit, after many years of evaluation, was actually issued. Equipment was purchased, moved on site, miners were employed, and are actually working, as I understand it. And then, lo and behold, EPA issues a formalized procedure document suggesting that they may revoke that permit. Yeah. Now that perhaps is the most egregious of all actions today.
It is, Chris. It's a great microcosm, I think, of what's going on here at large as we talk about trying to take away state sovereignty and rebuff congressional intent. The Spruce permit, I would contend, after its 13 years of review, is probably the most scrutinized industrial project anywhere in this country, especially surface mining in Appalachia, that's for sure. The West Virginia DEP, West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection, issued the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act permit, the Clean Water Act MPDS Section 402 permit, and the Corps of Engineers, after an exhaustive environmental impact statement review, issued the 404 permit. Again, as you mentioned, the men and equipment, the capitalization, the investment was mobilized, and EPA, as part of this reevaluation process for Appalachian coal mining that was declared by the White House Council on Environmental Quality and is now being implemented by EPA, decided that it would use its 404 authority, or 404 oversight authority, to essentially revoke that permit. Now, as far as we can tell, this is the first time in the history of the Clean Water Act that EPA has decided to use its oversight authority to take a permit that's already been issued. And the grounds for which EPA is proceeding against that on that permit are shaky at best. But there's just an example of the uncertainty that's being created in this state and in this industry and for our employees. If you are fortunate enough to have gone through the process and received one of these permits that is extremely detailed and extremely complicated, then you should be allowed to operate. But if you can't, if an agency can just step in at any time and revoke a lawfully issued permit, then what does that say about a viable investment opportunity for West Virginia coal? We think it's pretty damaging. And I think you'll see that if EPA doesn't change its current attitude. Companies will not risk significant investment here if EPA can ride in and take a permit away that's been issued by the state and by their sister federal agency, the Corps of Engineers.
Where does that stand at the current time? I know there's been hearings, there's been several communications or documents that have been sent to the company.
There was a hearing here in Charleston, Chris, over the summer, and EPA is currently in the process of reviewing internally what it will do with that permit after this extensive public comment period. So far, EPA has extended its own deadlines once. They have a given timeline where they have to respond to the company and the Corps, and they have extended that deadline at least once. So I think we're probably on another 60-day track. And I think everybody would expect, again, EPA to ask for another extension of time. So that's another further example of the damage that the federal government can wreak here. The EPA can extend its own deadlines, I guess, in forever,
Indefinitely.
And essentially pocket veto a permit, or in this case, pocket revoke a permit.
Something you said intrigues me about the actions of EPA and the restrictions through its the administration of its policies on mining extends to underground mining as well as surface mining.
Yes, sir.
That's an interesting point of this discussion, because I think most people believe that most of the more stringent policies are directed solely at surface mining and mountaintop mining.
Yeah, our detractors, whether they're in the federal government or in anti-mining extremist groups, have done a real good job characterizing this as a surface mining debate, or more specifically, a large-scale mountaintop mining debate. And that's just not true. The Clean Water Act 404, 402, and the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act apply to underground mines as well. And we have actually seen specific objections from EPA in the 404 process and the 402 process for underground mining operations. So it's just a matter of time, and it's just a function of common sense that what the restrictions, then the accusations that EPA makes relative to surface mining will overlap into underground mining, and actually that's already happened. Underground mines, Chris, as you know, produce some of the largest fill structures in the coal industry. They're refuse fills, and that is the non-coal partings that are recovered in the underground mining process and are brought to the surface. And those fills are structurally and environmentally really no different than valley fills that are associated with surface coal mining. And underground mines have to have those fills to operate. Otherwise, they can't clean the coal, take out the non-coal partings, and make a saleable product. And holding up a coal refuse permit for an underground mine can compromise what I refer to as the complex. Typically what you have, as you know, are 3 or 4 underground mines that feed a large prep plant. And that prep plant needs the coal refuse fill to operate. So if you can't get a coal refuse fill permit, you could essentially shutter production at 3 or 4 underground mines.
The other dimension of that, on your last point, is I'm aware of a number of situations out there where you have mining complexes, maybe 2 or 3 relatively small underground mines that are a part of a complex where the infrastructure was basically designed to accommodate a large area surface mine or even a mountaintop mine. Mm-hmm. So the mere existence of those underground mines are only there because of the surface mine operation, basically.
Yeah. Typically, Chris, what you have is the surface mine can offset the higher cost production from the underground mine, because and the higher costs are associated specifically with cleaning the coal. In a surface mine, you're on top of the coal seam versus an underground mine where you're in the coal seam. And the non-coal partings that we referenced earlier can be cleaned in a surface mine in the mining process, so you don't have to utilize the prep plant. So there's a substantial cost savings there. So you use the surface mining production to offset higher cost underground mining production. and mix the coal together to come up with a saleable product, steam market or steel market?
Throughout the past 18 months, going back to January, February, first quarter 2009, we've been in certainly a national, perhaps a worldwide recession. No one's making much of anything. No steel's being produced, no cars. We're in the double digits nationally and within the state here, unemployment ranks. So if there's a silver lining, or if there has been one, or a little bit of a bright spot, if you will, it's that we've been in a situation where there hasn't been a whole lot of power or electricity generated. So the holdup of these permits, has coincided with a recession. But now, and for the past 6 months or so, we're coming out of the recession, and once again, higher volumes of energy are needed. So it stands to reason that the timely issuance of these permits that are still being held hostage becomes more critical as we go forward.
It does, Chris. And as you mentioned, we were somewhat fortunate. If we were fortunate at all, it was that EPA's...
It's hard to call that a bright spot, yeah. but could have been a lot worse.
But EPA's efforts to block mining in West Virginia kind of coincided with this economic turmoil. So there wasn't a real demand for new production. But we're starting to come out of that, especially in the energy business, and especially with steel making internationally. And if we can't get the permits processed, it's not a matter of debate. You can't extract the coal. Now, what does that mean for West Virginia? It means lost opportunity. We could put people back to work, we could add new jobs, and we could do so in a coal market where the higher price will fetch a higher severance tax percentage for the state of West Virginia and its citizens. So just a real missed opportunity here in West Virginia.
Well, it is a missed opportunity, and people often compete Eastern mining with Western mining. And the fact of the matter is that while Eastern coal, primarily West Virginia and our surrounding states, are responsible for little less than 50% of the nation's production, you're absolutely correct on how labor-intensive Eastern production is. I believe the Eastern states represent 75–80% of all mining-related jobs within the country.
Yes.
Well, we're just about out of time here, and it seems like we've just scratched the surface of all these rather complex and technical environmental issues. But we're really pleased that you've taken the time to come by to talk to us today, and we'll have to get you back for maybe a round 2 or even a round 3 to cover more of the myriad of environmental and permitting issues affecting the industry. So thanks so much for coming.
Great to be here. Thank
Appreciate you. And thank you so much for watching our program today. We hope that you have found it to be enlightening, and we hope that you join us for another program in the future. Thank you.